Hello, everybody. In my short presentation today, I'd like to tell you a few things about some very important and very modern at the same time concepts that are used in literary theory. First of all, we will talk about structuralism and about poststructuralism, and very much associated with that, the theory of deconstruction, closely associated with Jacques Derrida. And then we'll continue with a few guidelines associated with poststructuralism, or exactly how to use poststructuralism in deconstructing a literary text or any other text we're dealing with. So let's begin. A very interesting concept is that which is called structuralism. Structuralism understands phenomena based on their structure, based on the elements that make up a whole. They make up a global entity, and more exactly, words, or poems, or narratives, or myths, and social practices. According to structuralism, there is an inner structure of composing elements which make up this whole, which make up this global structure. So these elements are not perceived as discrete entities, but they're always perceived as belonging to larger structure or systems. And then in this case, we have, of course, something that is probably familiar to you. This is the so-called sign systems. Semiotics deals with sign systems. So according to structuralism, very many entities are made up of a collection of signs, and these signs do belong to a certain inner organization that give us this sign system of that phenomenon. And then, of course, taken into consideration that what we're interested in is the global structure, something has to be considered complete. And then this complete, thus this what is complete, is associated with a notional center. So let's try to think of this structure, the one I'm just showing to you, which is seen as something made up of certain elements, so certain components, just like this one, or let me make it red for you to see better. So like this one, or this one, or this one, this one. But we're not so much interested in themselves as we're interested in the whole structure, as we're interested in the global entity which is given by these components. Now, if we move on to poststructuralism, which is a movement, which is a theory, which follows structuralism, as the name tells you, poststructuralism also insists on sign systems, but if structuralism saw them as something complete, something whose inner structure achieves something, a global entity. In the case of poststructuralism, these sign systems are no longer seen as incomplete, as no longer seen as complete. They are seen as incomplete. They are seen as something unfinished. They are seen as a kind of unknowable fragment. So if I say unknowable fragment, I can also have in mind certain fragments. And of course, we cannot know where they come from, what their meaning is, and where they may get to. And then, of course, if in the case of structuralism, we insisted on the existence of centers, these times we no longer have potential centers. If we do have one, it is very weak, or we don't have a center at all. How is the meaning made up in this case? The meaning is made up of sense in a different way, sense otherwise. So, if in the case of structuralism, the meaning was achieved by all of these elements taken together, in the case of poststructuralism, meaning is achieved by taking into consideration these elements, these constituents, individually. So, in this case, I'm interested in um, the components, in the elements that make up the structure. I'm interested in this one, I'm interested in this one, I'm interested in this one, and I'm interested in this one as well. So practically, I'm no longer interested in the outside structure. So if initially I was interested in the outside structure, in this case, the outside structure is just a shell that contains these inner elements. This one, this one, this one, and this one. And these elements are different. This one is a red circle. This one is a black one, a bigger one. This is an oval. And this is a square or anything that looks like one. So practically, in the case of post-structuralism, we are no longer interested in what makes up a whole, but what this whole is made up of. Closely associated with post-structuralism is deconstruction, because practically in order for us to get to the meaning of a structure, a text for instance, a social structure, or anything associated with that, we have to use this kind of deconstruction, which is, as you can see on my slide, breaking down a text or anything which may be associated with that. So we get to constituent differences. And as I told you, as I showed you in my previous drawing, a small circle, a bigger one, a red one, or a triangle, or a square, or anything of the kind. And then we have to identify notional centers. But as I told you, sometimes these notional centers are very weak, or sometimes they're not there at all. So we have to explore why certain elements are preferred, are privileged, why these elements are there themselves and not anything else. And then, sometimes more important than the center is the margin, or the margins, or what is marginalized. Sometimes these margins are there, sometimes the margins are not there. So we have to judge the entity according to these margins, which are no longer there. Taking all of these things into consideration, deconstruction is fascinated with what is not, what does not exist, is fascinated with absences, it is fascinated with gaps, it is fascinated with silences. Sometimes, and sometimes this may also get very important, with what is foregrounded or backgrounded, what is brought to the first plan, or what is taken, what is sent to the backstage. As I told you, the name which is very closely associated with deconstruction is the name of Jacques Derrida. He is a French critic, and according to Jacques Derrida, meaning is a ceaseless play of differences, because again, what counts is not is the same thing. What counts is what is different. What counts is what is present, what is here, or and what is not here, what is present, and what is absent. Sometimes we have absences. These also give us meanings. So things are there, things are understood, because sometimes they're not there. And the fact that they are not there is something that may give us meaning. And we have to think of the fact that if we take these elements in such a different way, we have to rethink hierarchies and establish differences. Establish what is different from something which we are used to, different from something which used to exist there before. So how do we practice post-structuralism? And this can be practiced on anything. Of course, our interest is on text, more exactly on literary text. So when we have a text in front of our eyes, one of the first things we have to take into consideration is the subject of that text, or different subjects, and how these subjects relate to each other or to one another, in what way they are similar, in what way they are different. And of course, because we talk about post-structuralism, what is important is the fact that these subjects are different. The second thing which we have to take into consideration is binary oppositions and differences. So what make these things different from each other? So the contrast, this one is big, this one is small. Does this create any tension between the fact that this object is small and this object is big? Sometimes, why do polarities, why do we use polarities better or sooner or before their opposites? Because polarities are things that exist there at the same time. Sometimes opposites don't have to exist there at the same time and in the same place. So practically when we talk about post-structuralism, what we're interested in is differences, is in what way things are different, in what way things are opposed to each other, in what way things are here or are not here. And the fact that things are not here, does this give us any meaning? Is this important? Do we understand anything from the absence of an object, of a thing, of an entity? The third thing that we have to take into consideration is the existence of centers and margins. And of course, I told you that in the case of structuralism, a center is very important. Whereas in the case of post-structuralism, centers are no longer important. Sometimes they're weak, sometimes they're absent. What appears now is, of course, the existence of margins. So, what is assumed to be central? This thing is central. Everything revolves around this thing. And then if we take this thing which may be central into consideration, sometimes we have to think of elements, of things, of entities, call them as you wish, that are marginal, that are pushed to the sides of our structure. And sometimes, not only are they pushed to the side, sometimes they're sent to the backstage, sometimes they're ignored completely. And then, of course, if we talk about centers and of margins, isn't it so that in this case we have not only one center, but several ones, different ones? To what extent these centers are different? To what extent these centers are opposed to each other or to one another, if it's several of them? And then In the case of post-structuralism and in the case of a text or anything social structure that we analyze, we have to deal with open and closed structures. So first of all, let's try to think of a text as a whole. So let's perceive it in its globalness. And then sometimes we have to think of a text as a series of gaps, as a series of things which are not told us. And the fact that these things are not told us is very important because beyond these gaps, we can see something else. We can perceive fragments of other words or other worlds. So the fact that we have gaps allows us to fill in these gaps, to perceive through these gaps something which hasn't been directly suggested by the writer. So not only the existence of the whole text as a tissue, but also as a text as a tissue with gaps in it. And what do we perceive through these gaps? It depends very much against what our tissue, against what our text is situated.